Okay, good morning. So we're going to finish off Mitzvah Siman Kuf Samach Beis today. Very two short seifim, and it's dealing with the important shaila of what happens if you have a plaster or some sort of bandage on your hand when you wash Netilas Yadayim. But first, let's do Sif Tesses, which is where we're up to, and then Sif Yud is it deals with the plaster situation. Okay, so it says the Machaba in Siman Kuf Samach Beis Sif Tes. When you pour water on your hand for Netilas Yadayim, you've got to be careful that there's no chatzitza on your hand, a bit of straw, or pebble, or something on your hand, because water will be metaher anything that's on your hand, and it'll be metaher the water that's on your hand. Mishnah is going to explain exactly what the issue is. Again, we see that if you pour a whole revius in one go, you have to be worried about this problem. So what is the problem? Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Sif Kotzen Samach Beis. In other words, if you're not careful and there's a bit of straw or something on your hands, and after you wash the second time, you find a bit of some straw or a pebble or something on your hand, Yodov Tmeis, your hands are Tomei. You've got to dry them. You've got to again wash first and do two pourings again. But if you remove this chatzitza after the first pouring, and then you wash your hand the second time, or with the second pouring it sort of washed away, maybe that's enough. I'm sure about that if you sort of discover it after the first time and then it sort of washed away. Even if they're very sort of loose and it's possible the water came underneath them, the psul over here is not because it's a chatzitza. There's a separate concern. What is that concern? We'll see in a second. Or there's some other chatzitza, some other impediment. Even if it's something which is created from water, i.e., it actually is water. We spoke about previously. Or you got a bit of snow or ice or hail which hasn't been crumbled. Dinam kitsrar v'kisam. They've got the same din as a straw or a pebble. If the thing we're talking about is sheleg, snow or borod or hail, we're not going to puzzle you if you find that after Netilas Yadayim. Again, for us, who we wash with plenty of water, less lon nafkusa b'chol zev v'chud. There's no concern about this, like the Mechaber says at the end. She'ein ma'im matarim. Now, rotzaloima. Here we go. The tam hapsul b'zehu mishum shemayim al hatzror. You've poured water onto your hands, and there's a straw or a pebble or something, and mishum shemayim shel hatzror nitzmu machmas yodov. Because you've got a bit of water which went onto the straw, which came from your hand. So that water is tomei. And then that water which stays on the tzror afterwards could remetame your hands. That's the problem. Because it's going to be the second lot of water is metaher your hand. It's not going to metaher the water that's on the tzror, and therefore then you're okay. So just to summarize sifches, what have we said? You've got to make sure your hands are free of any tzror or pebble or something. Not because it's a chatzitza. We said it's ruba in a makbid, b'diavad it's certainly okay. But the concern is that if you pour once with less than a revius, the water that's now going to go on the tzror is water that became tomei because it touched your hand, and now you wash a second time, you're not going to get rid of that tomei water. That tomei water that's on the tzror could remetame your hand. That's the problem. Okay, and therefore to either get rid of it beforehand or to wash with the whole revius. Okay, now Sif Yud, let's just finish this off. This is talking about a very practical situation where you have a bandage or a plaster, an elastoplaster, something on your hand. Says the Mechaber, Mishi yesh le maka b'yodeh, someone who's got some sort of wound or a tear and he's therefore got a bandage. Pirush Ingatua Belaz Oleha Dailo Sheitzel Shahayad Shelo B'Makam Haratia. It's enough that you wash the rest of the hand. You don't need to wash that part of the hand which has got the bandage. On the contrary, you should make sure that the water you pour over your hand should not touch the ratia. Why? Because that's going to make the water, that will make it ultome. Because if you wash the hand, and let's say then it goes on to the ratia, that's tome water, and therefore that's going to be matame subsequently. Or like we've seen several times, you pour revius, more than revius, over your hands, and therefore the water doesn't become tome in the first place. Finishes off the Ramon, as opposed to Maim Achronim, where you've got to be careful where the water goes. We'll see in Hashem. With Maim Rishonim, the water can go on the floor or on the karka or on a kli or whatever. We're not worried about the remnants of Maim Rishonim. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah for detail. Sivkot and Samach Zayin, Retia. Ayin Simon Kuf Samach Aleph Sivkot and Dalet Mishnah Berurah. He explains there in Mishnah Berurah what a retia is. That you put some medication, some cream, and then you put a bandage over it. Dailoi Samaches. Dailoi Mairi She'eni Yochel Hasira Machmas Keifa Maka. Now we're talking about a plaster or a bandage where you can't remove it because you know, for medical reasons. You've got a wound, you've got a scab, then you want to cover it. Or Commissioner Kosav Nisham Le'el B'Simen B'Mishnah Berurah L'Sif Cotton Hay Ayin Shom. U'Lekach Dailoi Ve'ein Zuna Tilach, and therefore it's sufficient that you wash the rest of your hands. You don't have to wet the bandage parts. You shouldn't wet the bandage parts. Ve'ein Zuna Tilach. It's not considered Netilas Hatzoin Kim She'eni Yochel Little Chetzi Hasheni, because you're not washing the second part. The part which is covered by the elastoplast, by the plaster, by the bandage, you can't cover it anyway. It's as if, Rahman al-San, you haven't got a finger, and therefore you can't wash that finger. What can you do? That part which is bandaged, you just can't wash it. End of story. Take a look at 49. He says, even if the majority of your hand is covered with some sort of bandage, that so for example, a person may have a bandage over the majority of their hand. You just have to wash the part which is not covered, because the part which is covered is as if it's not there. That we're not worried about that. If for tefillah purposes, it's going to be different. But for Netilas Yadayim purposes, you only wash that part of the hand which is not covered by the bandage. Carrying on the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot and Samachtes, Shar Hayad, you wash the rest of the hand. Vim Ein Yoch, a little Yad Klal Machmas Chayli. What happens if you can't? Your person is sick in bed, is not able to. Yichrech Yodov b'mapa. What we're going to see in Mr. Shem on next week in the next simon, that what happens if you can't, for whatever reason, you can't wash Netilas Yadayim. So then you cover the bread. You don't touch the food directly. You cover it with a serviette or a tissue or something like that. That's what you do. If a person is so unwell, he's in bed, he can't wash Netilas Yadayim. So then you just you make sure you don't touch the food. You cover it with a handkerchief or something like that. Okay, that we'll get to in Mr. Shem. If you look at the beginning of 51, he says, what if a person's got a whole, his whole left hand is covered in a plaster and a bandage, and you can only wash one hand. So what do you do? So he concludes that you wash that one hand that you can wash with a bracha. Okay, ayin sivkot and ayin. You've got to be careful if you do wash your hand. Don't let the water touch the bandage. That the water shouldn't touch the bandage. Because again, the second pouring is not going to matah the water from the first pouring if it goes onto the bandage. And that water which is tome, which is on the bandage, will then go al hayad on the hand, and it will re-matame the hand. Like we said in the previous sif. Ayin Aleph, if you're able to pour over the bandage or over the plaster, then just pour in one go. Do with more than revius. Because any water that happens afterwards, we're not worried about that. For kosva achronim, the eitzazu yofi yosim oferishon. In a way, if you can get the bandage wet, that will be a better eitzah to pour generously over the whole hand. Because otherwise sometimes it's very tricky to pour over the hand and not get the ratia, the bandage wet. It's good to cover the bandage, none of the dirt and the sweat and whatever will touch the food. If your bandage came off during the meal and you hadn't washed your hands and now you've exposed unwashed hands, sorry, you need to wash a second time. Kadin mapa, in the case of the same, so too in the case of the mapa, which we're going to get to, Mr. Shem, if you've got the mapa and the serviette comes away, you can't carry on eating. You've got to get the serviette back. Iron base, noitli maim rishonim. This is going on the Ramah, which says that Netilas maim noitli maim rishonim bein al kli bein al gabi karka. When you wash Netilas Yadayim maim rishonim before you have bread, that can be the water. We're not worried about what happens. It can go on the kli or it can go on the karka. Says the Mishnah Berurah, dahainu maim shelifnei hamazon. V'lafuki maim achronim chud lekam siman kuf pei alaf sif beis, which you got to be more careful about. So just to summarize, when you wash Netilas Yadayim for a maim rishonim and you've got a bandage, then you're allowed to wash Netilas Yadayim and just don't wash that part which is covered by a bandage or a plaster, and just be careful it doesn't get wet, because if you're using less than a revius and the water from the first pouring goes onto the bandage, it will become tomei. So better to pour, either to just avoid the bandage area at all, do Netilas Yadayim and just avoid the plaster, the bandage, or pour, if you can get it wet, pour generously, and therefore there's no mime which is tomei. Okay. Sure.